Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Chetan and I'm your host for today. We appreciate your continued interest in the integral technology and we can't wait to bring you all the insights into integral's technical and quality related aspects. Today's session will be covered by two speakers. The first part on the various features of integral will be discussed by Dr. Vijay. As you know, Dr. Vijay leads the business development at Steer Life. The subsequent part will be a few case studies and quality related aspects. This segment will be covered by Dr. Vinay Rao. Dr. Vinay leads application development at Steer Life. We also have a panel to answer your questions. Apart from today's speakers, the panel will also comprise of Dr. Babu Padmanabhan and Indu Bhushan. You'll find a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. Please drop in and ask your questions at any point in time, and the panel will answer them at the end of today's webinar. Please also participate in the polling questions at every break. We'll have 3 such questions, and we'll really appreciate if you can respond to each one of them. Without further ado, let's now go over to Vijay to commence today's webinar.
Thank you, Chetan. Thanks for your nice introduction. Today's session, we are going to be covering on the technical and quality aspects of integral in continuous granulation process. Moving ahead, the entire session is been split into 4 different sessions, and each sessions is going to be focusing on how integral is going to be beneficial to the end users. I will be covering about various features available in integral. Later, we have 3 more points which will be discussed later. Is going to be on case studies showing how integral can improve the quality and compliance. Third, we will be covering about overall the limitations of a typical batch process. And finally, how we can build the control by design and automation is going to be the 4th point we'll cover. Moving forward, let us now understand the current batch process. In past, we had 2 webinars where Dr. Babu Padmanabhan had discussed about the introduction of this integral technology, where also in the second webinar, Mr. Indu Bhushan also had discussed about various critical process parameters, the risk, and how you can overcome those things with some case studies. With that background, as we know, in a continuous manufacturing process, typically taking an example of oral solid dosage forms, typically tablets, you start from dispensing and you end up with coating. So each unit operations are connected each way. But after each process, you need to collect the material, give the material for quality testing. Once the quality control gives a clearance, then only it moves to the next step. This is one of the major limitations which comes in the batch process. Each process is independent and connection has been there only if you give a clearance and then moves to the next step. So finished products are generally offline tested, and then when I say tested offline, so it more goes by quality by testing. Currently, the batch manufacturing process, which involves milling and compression, is already a continuous process. Because you keep on feeding the material, the processor keeps on processing the material, and that is why it's a continuous process. Apart from that, blending and coating has now been also available into a continuous process. Earlier, it was more of a batch process. But today's point of discussion is going to be on the batch process, which is wet granulation and drying. So this currently is a batch process. And today's Steer's view is going to be that how this batch process can be converted into a continuous process. So before we understand the process and everything, it is more important for us to understand what is the hardware, how the equipment is, and what is the design, and what are the application of each units which is being connected to this integral. So let's focus on that. So as you see, we have two upstreams, which is going to be feeding of the material. When I say feeding, it is going to be solid as well as liquid. Liquid feeding is only been applicable when it is going to be a wet granulation process. If it is a melt granulation, probably we may not need a liquid feeding system. Moving ahead, next is an equipment processing zone. We call this as EPZ. So this consists of barrels, screws, and shafts. Each barrel is segmented and can be individually kept at different temperatures based on the processing requirements. At the end, once the granules are initiated, it gets discharged through a chute. And this is one of the unique design which has been made by Steer, where it passes the material as well as, if required, a pneumatic air is also being conveyed in this system. Further moving, we have two diverter valves. They have a specific purpose here, why we have used. Over a period of time, we will see in the next slides what are the role and application of these two diverter valves. Next, we have a collection bin. In the collection bin, there are multiple other opportunities, but this collection bin is to collect the material or connect the granules, and then it can be sent to the next section. Finally, there is a suction unit. So this is currently out of the processing area. So what the role is, it is able to suck the air, or it is able to convey the material from the EPZ to the granule collection bins. Finally, the HMI, which is human machine interface. This is where you interface between the machine and you give the commands for process to operate. After seeing this, let us have a 360-degree view of the processor, how it looks. The integral processor is consisting of various features which we discussed earlier, is been just represented in an animation where we can see various units connected to each other. We, after seeing those animation, this is a picture which shows about our integral gamma, which is already installed at a commercial, already installed for a commercial purpose. This integral gamma can produce more than 50 kg per hour. That's a good processing capacity. This system has a capability for drying, sizing in a single step. So a processor can do granulation, drying, and sizing in a single step. So we are looking forward how we can have multiple units in the market. So the next is alternative to the downstream. In the downstream, as you have seen earlier, there are two bins. There is an alternative, which is a spiral vibratory conveyor. A spiral vibratory conveyor helps the granules to get conditioned during the process of getting conveyed on a spiral conveyor. So this helps the granules to get conditioned and comes out, and this can be collected in a different bin. What you can see is a small animation where how the granules flow inside the vibrating conveyor. After discussing about the entire system, let us now focus deep down into the individual components. To start with, let's see the upstream process. So our upstream system is going to be the feeding system, and we would see how the feeders have an effective role in the processing and what are the different alternatives available. So there are three different alternatives which have been available. One is a gravimetric feeder, a volumetric feeder, and a force feeder. And each of these feeders comes with their own advantage and disadvantage. So in the next slide, we'll cover about advantage and disadvantage of a gravimetric versus volumetric. Force feeder has been generally used for a cohesive material. But we also have to see a step above this feeder. When I say step above, so you need to feed the material continuously, because the process being continuous, the material has to be fed continuously. So there are two options available. One is supplying the pre-mixed granules through a bin, which flows through gravity. Alternatively, you have a continuous blender, which feeds the material to the hopper in a continuous way. In this, what you could see is there are multiple feeders based on the internal components. It can feed individual material to a continuous blender, which is below. This continuous blender mixes each component and sends the pre-blended material to the twin screw processor. Let us now move to the next point where we have a polling question. Over to you, Chetan.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Let's now go to the first poll question. In a continuous granulation system, which feeding process would you prefer? Please provide your responses. Is it split feeding with continuous blender? Is it single feeding with gravimetric feeder? Is it single feeding with volumetric feeder? We have about 30 more seconds. Also, if you have any questions on the ongoing webinar, please drop into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens and kindly ask your questions. Our panelists will answer them at the end. We have another 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we end the poll. So we are sharing the poll results. 52% of the respondents feel that split feeding with continuous blender is the preference. 29% feel that single feeding with gravimetric feeder is the preference. And another 19% feel that single feeding with volumetric feeder is the choice. Let's now go back to Dr. Vijay to continue with the webinar.
So thanks for that polling question. So what you could understand, a split feeding with various internal components is one of the preferred choice. And we do also agree, because if we want to make integrated continuous processing system, the initial step of integral, which is a continuous granulator, the initial step also has to be kind of a continuous. Now, in this slide, we will understand more on the comparison between a gravimetric and volumetric mode. So these two systems come with their own advantage and disadvantage. So here, what we see is in a volumetric, it is more being controlled by the speed of the motor, the screw of the RPM of the screw. Whereas in case of gravimetric, it has been controlled in terms of its delivery. There is a controller which provides an input to feed the material at a set rate in terms of kg per hour. Volumetric is more of an open loop. That means there is no feedback mechanism. But in case of a gravimetric, there is a closed loop system where there is a feedback mechanism. When I say a feedback mechanism, any change of the rate can be again fine-tuned to the desired or the set feed rate. The advantage of volumetric feeder is that you can use this whenever there is CPP or critical processing process parameter of feeding is not very critical. In those cases, the volumetric feeder can be used. But in case of a gravimetric feeder, the accuracy is very, very high. So it can be around 0.2 to 0.5% of the total set value. And here it requires a very minimal human intervention. If it does all those things, like why then volumetric feeder? So volumetric feeder can be used where the material has a good flow property. That means if the flow is good, the RPM of the feeder keeps on rotating and the material has been discharged at the feed rate. But it also comes with some disadvantage, which is it needs a calibration at every start of the batch, whereas a gravimetric doesn't need this requirement. But it's a bit a complex system where the training of the operator is highly essential. Now in this slide, let us see how the flow of the material goes into the processor. So as you see from the feeder, the material is now sent to an intake zone of the processor. From there, it moves further. At this point, the solid and liquid are going to be mixed together. So here it is very important for the solid and the liquid to be synchronized. So when I say synchronized in terms of their weight, it has to be fed uniformly. Later stage, Once the solid and liquid are mixed together, there is a kneading section. And in this kneading section, the material, both solid and liquid, get mixed and then move forward. If the process is meant for multi-granulation, so you don't need to add any liquid. But if it is going to be a wet granulation process, you need to add liquid. And when you add to liquid, then you need to be having the terminal end of the processor to be heated. Or if it is a multi-granulation process, you can cool it, so that once the material comes out of the processor, it has been either cooled or there is any steam or any amount of moisture which has been there will be taken up in the later stages. From the discharge chute, it moves to the collection bin. So this suction system is going to be a driver where it sucks the total granules and gets collected into the bin. So now we have understood about the upstream, we have understood the processing section. Let us also discuss about what is going to be the downstream. As we see the processor, so I'm going to be discussing about the area which is covered now. This is a downstream process. Now, as I've discussed, heat has been there. Last terminal barrels are heated or cooled based on the application you're looking at, whether it is going to be a wet or a melt granulation. This is how the flow of the pneumatic is going to be, the air or the material is going to be. So there are two diverter valves, and these diverter valves has a unique applications. So this diverter valve helps to divert the material or make a single stream. So once one stream is open, the other stream is closed. So that is why you start collecting the material in one single bin. And finally, the containers. So we have two containers. Alternative can be a spiral conveying chamber. If you need to understand the entire process of the downstream, the air displacement is going to be unidirectional. So the unidirectional is because of the suction system at the terminal end. In a wet granulation process, granules are wet and hot, and the downstream system helps the granules to get dried and cooled so that it is available for the transfer to the next system. In case of melt granulation, the granules are going to be hot, and the terminal processing system cools the granules and helps condition them. So there is some advantage of using a multiple bin section. The reason being, when you start the process, typically like any compression machine, when you start, there is going to be some adjustment you need to do in terms of weight, hardness, but initials are going to be rejected. In the similar way, at the initial startup, there will be some material which is going to be discarded, and the diverter valve helps to discard the initial setup. And it's also been useful at the shutdown process. But very importantly, what is the role is that this helps in segregation of the granules in a timely manner. Because being a continuous process, we have seen in a tablet compression machine, we collect in a separate drum. In a similar way, the granules from integrals are being collected in a separate bin. So this helps us a proper segregation. Finally, from my side, it is going to be various application or various types of granulation where integral can have a major role to play. One is a wet granulation process where we use a liquid binder or a water to granulate the entire mass. And further, there is a granulation zone where you need size and dry the granules. In case of melt granulation, so you are not using any liquid binder. It is going to be a meltable binder, or it is going to be a meltable excipient, which melts partially. Once it melts, it is able to agglomerate and send the material forward. In the next section, we'll see that it's going to be cooling those granules. And then it goes to the downstream equipment. There is a third application, which is also a moisture activated granulation, where we don't have to add any external source of moisture. Instead, the moisture can be generated in form of a steam by heating the material. And when I say heating the material, this material will be having some load of moisture, and the steam is generated, and it helps in granulating. And further, it behaves the steps of a wet granulation process, because there's some moisture which has been generated. But drying may not be very critical over here, because it's a very limited amount of water has been added. So there has been various applications which we have studied. Few of the applications where already there are some commercial applications for that. Few of them are under progress. So we are working on these various areas. With this, I complete my session, and the next section is going to be handled by Dr. Vinay Rao, and he is going to be discussing about case studies and key quality differences between the batch and the continuous process. So over to Dr. Vinay Rao, but I think before this, there is one polling question. Over to you, Chetan.
Yes. So let's move on to the second polling question. As per your estimate, what is the risk involved in converting the current batch process into continuous process? Is it high risk? Is it moderate risk? Or is it low risk? Please select your answer from the list of options displayed on your screen. We have another 30 seconds to respond. Also, please note that you have a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to ask your questions, and our panel members will respond to each of your questions at the end of today's webinar. We have another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. We're ending the poll. So, majority of you believe that it's moderate risk in converting the current batch process to continuous process. Almost equal number of people believe that the risk is either high or low. So let's now go back to Dr. Vinay Rao to cover a few case studies and also a few quality related aspects.
So thank you, Dr. Vijay and Chetan, and good evening to all ladies and gentlemen. I thank you for your response to the poll questions. I see that majority of you are talking that it's a moderate risk of converting a batch to a continuous process. That's good news. Some of you feel that it's a high risk and some of you feel that it's a low risk. So what I will do is I'll take you through a couple of case studies where we have attempted to convert two high volume formulations from RMG batch granulation process to integral continuous granulation process and compare the properties of the granules and the tablets. So the first case study is on granulation of metformin hydrochloride by wet granulation process. Metformin is a high dose drug and high volume, and it is highly cost sensitive. The RMG process, which is currently followed, has a large footprint and is expensive in terms of power consumption and manpower requirement. The goal of this case study is to produce granules and tablets having comparable quality attributes using integral system with no change in Q1 and Q2. In the integral continuous system, the pre-blend of API and the binder is fed. Water is used as the granulating fluid. It is pumped here in this barrel and is used as an agglomeration takes place in the granulation zone. Till this point, the barrels are maintained at ambient temperature. In the heating zone, the barrels are set to 100 degrees centigrade to achieve drying and sizing of the granules. Dried and sized granules are collected at the discharge. The granules were evaluated for their physical properties and found comparable to those achieved by the RMG process. The granules were further compressed, lubricated with magnesium stearate and compressed into tablets. The physical properties of the tablets were also comparable to those achieved by the conventional RMG process. The in vitro dissolution profile was tested, and this resulted in a high similarity factor. For tablets compressed from the integral system, Significantly less tablet-to-tablet variation was observed in the 10 minutes of the profile testing. This may be attributed to uniform distribution of the binder when a thin stream of material is handled during granulation as compared to when the bulk of the mass is granulated. The key takeaway from this case study is that we were successful in achieving comparable granule and tablet properties without any change in qualitative and quantitative formula. This indicates that the mechanistic principles of granulation, drying and sizing, which happens in a single step, are similar to those of the batch processing equipment train where multiple equipments are used. As per the draft FDA guidelines on CM or continuous manufacturing, these changes may be qualified for prior approval submission filing strategy with no requirement for additional bioequivalence evaluation. These guidelines were recently released by FDA in 2019. In the second case study, there are two drugs, API 1, which is high dose, and API 2, which is low dose. Both the APIs have different physicochemical properties. For example, API 1 is practically insoluble in water, while API 2 is low melting. The current RMG process, only API 1 is granulated, while API 2 is added extra granularly and blended. The ungranulated API 2 has a risk of sticking during compression. Also, there are chances of non-conformance of the content uniformity for API 2. The goal of this study was to develop a continuous process for combining both APIs together using the integral. The quality attributes of granules and tablets to meet the existing specification. In the integral system, the pre-blend of both API as well as other excipients was fed. Liquid surfactant was diluted in a small amount of water and it was pumped into the processor at the rate of 2% weight by weight. Partial melting of API 2 was done by heating in the barrels in the kneading zone, which provided the agglomeration. Then the granules were cooled and sized in the cooling zone before discharge. The physicochemical properties of granules and tablets were conforming to the specification. Since melt granulation process was used, impurity profile testing was carried out for both the drugs and it was found within acceptable limits. Dissolution test values were complying to the specifications. The dissolution profiles indicate that for the practically insoluble API 1, the uniformity of liquid surfactant distribution is efficient. Also, during the process, there is no interaction between the two drugs since the dissolution profiles are distinctly different and with no generation of impurities is observed. The key takeaway from this case study is that granulation could be achieved without any Q1 and Q2 change. The granules and tablet properties meet all specifications since the API 2 is now added during the granulation process. The risk of non-conformance for content uniformity is reduced. This change also qualifies for prior approval submission without additional bioequivalence study as a filing strategy. Now, I shall briefly describe to you the key quality differences between a batch and a continuous process. The topic is vast. In the presentation, we are only dwelling on the differences at a broad level just to provoke your thoughts and interest in continuous processing system. Before we go there, we have one more polling question, number 3 for you. Chetan?
Yes. So let's see what we have on the third polling question. Out of the following 3 factors, which one is the major differentiator between a batch process and a continuous process? Is it traceability? Is it flexibility? Or is it scalability? We have another 30 seconds to answer this question. Also, please note that you have the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. So please feel free to ask your questions. Our panel will take up all the questions at the end of this webinar, and they will answer all the questions. We have another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and we end the poll. So a majority of you feel that the major differentiator is scalability, followed by traceability and flexibility. Back to Dr. Vijay and Dr. Vinay to complete the final part of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Prince. It was great to know that scalability you feel is a differentiator. So let us see what is the key takeaways from the quality concepts on each of these. So first key concept. So these key concepts, the first key concept is on process dynamic. In the batch process, since it relies on endpoint determination in each step, performance of each step in the process is independent of the prior step or the next step. Hence, it is static. Process depends on limited process variables and product properties. For integral continuous process system, it works at a steady state. A set of CPPs and CQAs are kept close to the target value. Transient disturbances in the process parameters are measured and are controllable within the design space. Hence, we call that continuous process is defined as a dynamic steady state. Batch size. Coming to batch size, all of us know that in a batch process, batch size is typically equal multiple lots blended in one batch. While in case of continuous process, it offers great flexibility in terms of batch size because it can be based on runtime, it can be based on total material produced, it can be based on total material processed, or even any major production event like a change in the control of the API. Then next we go to traceability. Batch process. Typically, once multiple lots are blended to form a batch, traceability is lost. Investigation in any non-conformance is limited in nature since limited data of previous steps is available. However, in case of continuous processing, integral continuous processing system, each step of the process is integrated with the previous step as well as the next step. Hence, a connection between the material traceability and the batch can be easily established. Coming to uniformity, batch process uniformity is only after blending, but it is not a part of process design. So traceability and uniformity of the batch in an integral continuous granulation system is built in the design of the process with respect to unidirectional flow of material, handling of material in a thin stream, continuous seamless processing, continuous monitoring and control of process parameters, and facility of online or inline sampling and testing. Next, we come to material diversion system, which is completely absent in the batch process, but it's a unique feature of integral continuous processing system. Material is typically diverted during startup, during shutdown, during major processing events, and or if there is any non-conformance in the process, if any material can be diverted, and once the process is back to steady state, you can start collecting the material. Also, the material diversion system can be used for at-line collection of samples at predetermined intervals. Now, coming to design space, since in the batch process, each step is based on endpoint testing and few process parameters, the design space is narrow and static for a given piece of equipment. For integral continuous granulation system, each run generates a large amount of data for critical process parameters as well as critical quality attributes. This helps in concurrent continuous process verification as well as a risk-based opportunity to modify the design space. Now, next key concept we'll discuss is on scale-up consideration. For a batch process, there are only two options. Either we scale out, take multiple lots on the same equipment train, or scale up is non-linear, where we simply change the size of the equipment. In case of integral continuous granulation system, it provides great flexibility with respect to scale up. It can be linear based on either time, mass flow, or both time as well as mass flow. Another option available for scale up is scale out. Multiple streams of the same size processing equipment will produce materials which are equivalent from different machines, and this will help in just doubling or tripling the output based on how many lines you set up. Or of course it is scale up, where you go for a higher scale of equipment, a bigger dimension of equipment, but this scale up approach calls for another full scale process validation and is considered as a major change. Next is process validation. Process validation for a typical batch process is carried out individually for each piece of equipment in the train. It is prospective, segmented, and rigid boundary of tolerance. However, in case of integral continuous granulation system, process validation starts right from process design stage. Equipment qualification and process design go hand in hand. Once the system is installed at the production site, the design space generated during process development is continuously verified and impact of runtime is evaluated. Also, process robustness is established for all known sources of variability. Now, finally, I'll touch upon regulatory filing strategy for batch to continuous. As per the draft guidelines of FDA for continuous manufacturing of 2019, the recommendation is that if Q1 and Q2 are equivalent and product characteristics are equivalent, the change qualifies for prior approval submission with no bioequivalence study required. However, the agency also recommends controlled correspondence with the agency to understand the case-by-case regulatory requirement. Finally, I end with the key quality concepts, a summary of the key quality concepts which we have been talking about. And the current batch system is quality by testing, as Dr. Vijay has already discussed. An integral continuous manufacturing system allows for a complete understanding of the process and its impact on the product. Since the operation is integrated and runs at steady state, it allows for mechanistic modeling and drawing meaningful and dynamic design space. Hence, moving from batch to continuous, we graduate from quality by testing to quality by design. The integral system offers enormous potential for integrating with other downstream processes like blending, compression, coating, and packing. This will enable continuous and smart manufacturing. The fully integrated manufacturing system will be self-evolving, will be able to predict risk and have ability to mitigate the risk, and the process will be robust and dynamic in nature. So thank you very much, friends. The future depends on what you do today. That is what is told by the Father of Nation, and I hope we do good today. Thank you. It is time to change. Thank you for your time.